¿Ya? ¿Me oyen? Hola a todos, buenas tardes. Es un placer estar aquí con todos ustedes. Esta presentación, exhibición de retrocolectiva, la curadora Doreen Rios. Hello everybody, it's really lovely to be here. Welcome you all to Qualcomm Institute and Gallery at QI for the Retro Colectiva exhibition curated by Doreen Rios. Focused to some degree on 40 years of gestures that have been developed in co-creation, co-production, collaboration with a number of artist groups specifically. So it covers at brief moments the work that... hola, ¿quién está allí? ¿Eres tú, Doreen? ¿Hay alguien? Transmisiones. Rubén, ¿me oyes? La comunidad está aquí, no sé. Lots of multitude transmissions, undead media. So what I like to do is present briefly some key moments of the Retro Colectiva, which is a continuation of an exhibition that started in Mexico City at Centro de Cultura Digital, where I met Doreen. And out of that came the second part here that again builds on a series of call and responses in creating new retrocolectivas that is now developing with the members of Electronic Disturbance 2.0 and Doreen and her collaborator Ricardo Sierras of Antimaterias. Then we'll be doing a gesture of planetary echoologies on May 19th at 5 p.m. And all of you are welcome to come. So I'm just going to start off. We're all going to try to do our 15 minutes. So I'll start now. I was very lucky to be hired by Cal IT2 back in 2004 and then be embedded in the Department of Visual Arts. I am an associate professor, chair of the Department of Visual Arts, and a principal investigator here at Cal IT2 QI under the kindness of Ramesh Rao and Larry Schmar. I've been a part of many different groups: Critical Art Ensemble, Electronic Disturbance 1.0, 2.0, Bang Lab, Bits, Atoms, Neurons, and Genes, Particle Group, but there's also Fake Shop and other groups that are briefly appear in the exhibition. I was born on the border in El Paso, Texas, but I didn't stay there very long. At about 6 months, my family took me to Las Vegas, Nevada, and so I was learning from Las Vegas even before the 1972 book, Learning from Las Vegas. So a lot of the work that's been done has really blossomed out of the dialogue that I had for those many years in Las Vegas. And then I'll just run through all the interesting stuff. But I ended up in Tallahassee, Florida in 1981. And there I met a group of artists that became known as Critical Art Ensemble. There in the mustache is Steve Barnes, the first artist we ever met who was using computers, and he hated computers. Next to him was Dorian Burr, a photographer, and she hated photography. There I am in the middle. I was a performance artist, and I hated performance art. Next to him was Hope Kurtz, a poet, and guess what? She hated poetry. And next to her was Steve Kurtz, a filmmaker, and he hated film. So you can see that we were intensely together on a single issue, hate of our own aesthetic loves. And part of the project was to begin to investigate micro-gestures. And one of them was the creation of handmade poetry books that led to the development of various gestures, one of them micro-gestures, And the other was to investigate this particular kind of question that hopefully I can bring up here, which is the methods that we developed in terms of poetry and microgestures that eventually led to electronic civil disobedience. This is Izu's chisel, circa 1983 or so.
This is where we produce the dribble and eternity. I'm going to start the film now. Good. Has the film started yet? Has the film started yet?
I don't know. Just a minute. I gotta scratch some stuff on these photographs. Give me that chisel. Here.
Has the film started yet?
Gotta scratch these photographs. I'm chiseling.
Has the film started yet?
You should have done this on video.
Has the film started yet?
I think this is gonna have great political impact. This will be the end of chiseling.
Has the film started yet? Hey, Hope. What are you doing?
Plagiarizing.
So that was a key moment in developing the work that we were doing. That is, plagiarism or utopian plagiarism was the element that led towards the development of electronic civil disobedience and electronic disturbance. That is, that using utopian plagiarism that came through a series of investigations of poetry, or what we would call in the early days hypertext, it led us into this idea of electronic civil disobedience, which in the 90s led to the development of a practice with electronic disturbance theater 1.0.
It was in the hills of Chiapas in 1994 that the first shots were fired in the information war. Despite being without phones or electricity, Mexico's Zapatista rebels took the revolution online, issuing a call to arms across the internet for others to join them in a worldwide struggle against economic imperialism. Ricardo Dominguez and his electronic disturbance theatre were among the first to heed the call.
When I came to New York in 1991, what I was looking for was a platform that would allow me to create a space for electronic civil disobedience.
Ricardo Dominguez, Electronic Disturbance Theater, New York. Digital Zapatista.
Electronic civil disobedience is nonviolent direct action online. It follows the theory of Thoreau on civil disobedience that was then developed by Gandhi, Martin Luther King, ACT UP during the 80s, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. We never destroy a server. We never change anybody's web page. We never hijack their name or domain name.
In 1998, Electronic Disturbance Theater releases FloodNet, the first automated virtual sit-in software with actions against the Mexican president's website, several Mexican banks, Frankfurt Stock Exchange, and even tries attacking the Pentagon. At one point, the Pentagon fires back with hostile Java applets, crashing the attacker's system.
I'll stop there because the group that came out of this was Electronic Disturbance Theater, and I was very lucky to meet this particular group of artists. One of them was Stephen Ray, who was a scholar on information war there with a beard in the University of Texas at Austin. I had read his dissertation on information war and the drug war, and I learned quite a bit from it. And I asked him to start participating in the dialogue. Next to him was Carmen Karasik, a bug hunter and new media artist from Boston that designed the look of FloodNet. Then myself, and then over at the far end is Professor Brett Stahlbaum, who was a new media artist in San Jose, California at that time. And so while we didn't meet in the flesh, we gathered digitally and thought about electronic civil disobedience. And because of these three people, again, just like Critical Art Ensemble, a practice was created that actualized participation on a global level. That you will see bits and pieces of that in the exhibition as well. Now, while this was happening, I was also in Williamsburg, New York, and there in Williamsburg, I was part of a group called Fake Shop, and Fake Shop was using early See You, See Me that was very useful. And we did this in Williamsburg, and we would use Coma, the science fiction film, in this particular case, in a warehouse, and then use early See You, See Me, Cornell University systems for streaming video and sound. And of course, it was the size of a postage stamp, but it was that See You, See Me that then allowed me to start doing other work with the Zapatistas as well. And I'll show you a little bit of here's what See You, See Me looks like as we were doing these performances. You'll see a bit of that in the exhibition as well. And out of that Fake Shop project, was able to create a larger digital Zapatista community that entered into various communiques and dialogues that finally created hacktivism, which was the kind of global version of electronic civil disobedience that joined with the ultra-globalization movement, the battle in Seattle, and you can see the many people that participated in this kind of large hacktivist network. And this book is now available for free in the gallery. It was never published because it got too big. It was too unwieldy because too many people participated in it, but you can have it now. Then I was hired here, and a project was developed called the Transporter Immigrant Tool with a new group of individuals of Electronic Disturbance 2.0, which was Brett Stahlbaum, Professor Stahlbaum, Professor Amy Sarah Carroll, experimental poet and scholar, Misha Cardenas, an MFA in transmedia, and Eli Mermad, a mixed reality musician.
¿Puede la tecnología transformarse en un vehículo de información? ¿Que logre salvar vidas? ¿Puede la poesía transformarse en código? ¿El código en poesía?
The transitivity of the transporter immigrant tool.
Transition, song of my cells.
2. When you outgrow that definition, look for the trends of transcendentalism.
Los viajeros indígenas en el corredor México-Estados Unidos se han abastecido de agua utilizando las hojas de yuca y agave.
This particular project caused another level of disturbance wherein the Electronic Disturbance Theater was under investigation by Congress, the FBI, this university, UCOP. It created a lot of disturbance, but its main focus in the disturbance was poetry. And you'll hear some of that in a moment. And then I'll end with a piece that I always try to collaborate with community like the MFAs, and this is a piece we did a few years ago.
This is Shruti Tamilsamy reporting for BBS News in an unusually cold and wet San Diego. With Trump's 30-foot precast concrete border wall nearing completion in the southern United States, a lot of people are asking what will happen to people who are trying to cross the border seeking a better life. One San Diego company might have answers. Today, I'm meeting with Roberto Rodriguez, owner of 31-Foot Ladders, a San Diego-based company that got its start in the summer of 2016 and whose profits are skyrocketing. 31-Foot Ladders build, as you might have guessed, 31-foot ladders to aid people who are trying to get over Trump's 30-foot tall border wall and make a new life for themselves. Roberto, tell us, how did you get the idea for 31-foot ladders?
Well, I was watching the news late one night during the primaries, and there was all this discussion about Trump's proposal of building a 30-foot tall, beautiful concrete wall all across the southern border to make America safe again. And on this particular news program, the interviewer asked some Customs and Border Patrol agents about what they thought about this 30-foot wall. And at least she reported that they said that the only thing this 30-foot tall border wall would do was create a market for a 31-foot ladder. And I thought, that is a great business idea. So I went online, I bought the domain 31footladders.net.
That's amazing. You got this idea from a news program. How did you turn that into a reality?
Well, I really didn't think he would win. But once he did, I was pretty glad. I had bought the web address, so I filed my paperwork to create 31-foot ladders, and we've been growing ever since. I have maybe about 50 employees right now. We can't fill our orders, and we're working 24 hours a day.
Wow. Could we have a look at it?
Yes, of course.
Roberto took me all around the shop and showed me the various tools and processes used in creating the 31-foot ladders, including one key innovation, the integrated rope.
Yes, the rope. Well, that's the tricky part, right? So the 30-foot wall will be precast concrete. And so if you have a 31-foot ladder and you make it to the top, then the drop is going to be very dangerous, right? You could fall, break your leg, or perhaps even die. So that's not really a strong business model to build on. So one night I was watching the news again, and this time Trump, who had now been elected, was being asked the same question, right? Well, what if a person has a 31-foot ladder? What will happen? And he said, well, you know, they might make it to the top, but there's nowhere for them to go, right? Unless they have a rope. And so that really became key, right? That's when we started adding rope to the 31-foot ladders.
That's sort of amazing. So it's like you got your business plan from Trump himself.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things is that really costly for startup businesses like ours is the design cost. So it really overrode all of that.
Just one more question though. How are you're making these in San Diego. How do you get them across the border? Are you paying a lot of customs on these?
Oh, no. We don't ship them to Mexico. There's no market for them in Mexico.
So you're not making them for immigrants to cross into the United States?
No. I mean, one of the things is that there is no hope here in the U.S. anymore. So these ladders are being built so people can escape.
Into Mexico?
Yes.
From the United States?
Exactly.
I suppose that makes sense as well.
It does as a business model, and that's what we're thinking about.
Wow, yeah. So you heard it here first on BBS. This is Shruti Tamalswamy. Thank you so much, Roberto, for this talk.
Oh, thank you.
So I like to work with my students. That was Andrew Strom who did that piece. Again, collaborating, co-creating at multiple scales. And so now I'd like to introduce the curator, Doreen Rios, investigadora, docente, especializada en cultura digital, focusing as a curator and artist on digital culture. She is from Toluca, Mexico, 1992. She was the person who we had a conversation with in Mexico City at Centro de Cultura Digital, and she's also an artist in antimateria, and so we're very lucky to have her here virtually. And so then I'll present the other individuals as we move forward. Doreen, hola.
Hola.
¿Puedes comenzar?
Yeah, okay, perfect. Well, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. Sadly, I couldn't make it to be there physically, and well, actually talking about borders, ironically, I would say that the main reason was because I do not have a US visa at the moment. So yeah, I guess the conversation can also start from there. And one of the things that I'd like to share today was part of the process of doing all of the research in regards to this Retrocolectiva exhibition, and also, let's say, part of all of the layers that were or had to be peeled in between. So yeah, like Ricardo mentioned, we met each other back in 2019 when he and Amy and Se were visiting Mexico City, and I was at the Centro de Cultura Digital. I used to be the chief curator there, and we started talking about some possibilities about presenting this Retrocolectiva exhibition there, and what could be the aims for it, and what could be the conversation to be developed from there. And I myself had been very interested in Ricardo's practice and everything that he had done with several collectives, but mainly with electronic disturbance theater, particularly due to my research interests in regards to digital culture and tactical media. So one of the things that was very interesting for me was to think about the fact that a lot of these gestures and a lot of these performances and collective, let's say, radical collectiveness that was developed online, even if it did have like a very strong connection to what was going on in Mexico in terms of politics, of course, and in terms of the way certain laws had been passed and certain approaches to neoliberalism and, of course, migration policies were in the public eye. But then at the same time, there was not a lot of information in regards to these gestures, but particularly from within Mexico. And that is something that I found very curious, especially when thinking about the kind of conversation that could be developed nowadays if we were looking into what had happened through or fueled by the internet and several technologies in the past. So that was probably one of my main questions when we met. Why didn't Mexican media cover these stories? And if they did, why can't I find much of it out there? So that's what pretty much started our conversation, and also about the notion of the archive and thinking about how could we activate Ricardo's archive that was mainly, let's say, physically present, and that you can have a look at it on the gallery space as well. And how that could be translated into other ways of reactivating certain conversations that, of course, didn't necessarily go anywhere, but that by revisiting these gestures and revisiting these artworks and these, let's say, participative models could also deliver another way of approaching the present, which was something that I was very interested on. So I'm gonna start sharing my screen just to share with you some of these process. So what you can see in this video over here is a guided navigation through the online exhibition that we opened last November, which covered basically 3 main areas. So we presented what you can see here, that is FloodNet. We also presented an online version of Transborder Immigrant Tour, which was designed and developed by Ian Allan Paul, which is also available at the gallery space. I think it is looking into the outside space, so it's like the outside wall there, which was also a very interesting conversation in regards to a project that was not necessarily or not initially thought as an online experience or an online approach. However, at some point, it also made sense to rethink what does it mean nowadays to talk and to think and to, in a way, experience Transborder Immigrant Tool through the internet. And then we also had this research, archival research part, which was basically what I had been working with in collaboration, of course, very closely with Ricardo and Amy as well. And this is something that I found very interesting because at first, of course, it was 2019. We started talking about what could we do next? How can we use, say, physically the Centro de Cultura Digital building, and how could we, in a way, grasp from the details of the architecture of this space, which, in case you haven't seen it, it's an underground space, and it's right below a very, very polemic monument that we call the suavicrema, which is a type of wafer cookie, and which was also very closely tied to a lot of issues in terms of corruption. So the fact that there's a cultural center being developed below this very controversial monument, I thought it was already a good hotspot or a good starting point to reconnect and fuel and refuel this conversation in regards to radical collectiveness online, and also to the kind of gestures that could be made and seen and developed from speculative fiction and utopian plagiarism, and then also thinking about how do we reappropriate all of these symbols, which is something that I find very compelling in all of Ricardo's collaborations. How can we reappropriate these symbols to create other kind of conversations and of analysis of the current moment? So at some point, of course, in the early 2020, we realized that we were not going to be able to necessarily develop the exhibition in the physical space, but then having this conversation in regards to, okay, so if we're talking about radical collectiveness online, and we're talking about webs, and we're talking about nodes, and we're talking about gestures and conversations that actually happen, say, mainly on an online space, why don't we just jump into it and, be surrounded by it and have this exhibition happen online? So that's what we did. But part of this process as well, like I mentioned, was having this approach to the archive, the physical archive that Ricardo had on his studio, which was later on digitized and sent over to me to have a look at what was going on there. And to be absolutely honest, at first I thought, I might have like this very research-led approach to this archive and make sense of all of these historical layers that also tie to sociopolitical, a sociopolitical context and economical context, and the way a lot of policies have been developed and redeveloped and rethought throughout these 20 years or 20 plus years of practice that I was looking into within this particular archive. But at some point I realized that developing research that ended up on a text might not necessarily make sense at all, especially because I didn't want to have a chronological approach to it, in the sense that we were trying to have a conversation that we know is still very current and very present and very urgent to have. And by displaying or having an approach that was absolutely chronological was in no way the best approach for it. So I started this, this map that you see over here, this diagram, as a way of trying to make sense of what I was looking at in this archive. But then at some point I realized that probably the research itself could be shaped as this diagram itself. So what I did over here was basically to think about the levels of implication and of interaction that these gestures had in several areas of, yes, the art world on one hand, but then on the other, in a lot of other, let's say, areas of society, which is something that I found very compelling by having a look at all of these, from newspapers and interviews to magazine articles to other videos that have been developed over time that were not necessarily available, all of them online. And then also how all of these conversations start to, in a way, explode into other areas, which is something that I always find very interesting to work with, especially because it means that you can have different kinds of conversations and reflections and analysis from there. So what started mainly as a way of making sense of what I was working with, I realized that the three main levels of implication within this archive mainly were tied to notions of intimacy, and also by the action or the gesture of having or thinking about zooming in and zooming out, being having a look at a very detailed area of, let's say, a particular artwork or a case study, and then zooming out and trying to get and to see the big picture. So what we were looking at in here is mainly this research that started from of course, the central part here, that is Ricardo Dominguez, say, as an individual, and what he had written and what he had developed, and part of his own personal history. And then we can see the outside layer of this, or the second layer of this, which is his work with all of these collectives that he had been talking about, like, of course, Electronic Disturbance Theater, Critical Art Ensemble, Particle Group, the Verbal Group, Fake Shop, but also the UC Center for Drone Policy and Ethics, and also The Thing, and also other kind of activations by, let's say, for instance, the Committee for Democracy in Mexico. And getting a general sense of what had happened there, how it connects as well with a practice and a series of gestures that could be seen and could be read from within performance, but also could be seen and read from within net art, and hacktivism and text. And then starting to slowly move to the outskirts of these collaborations into, let's say, the external view or the external perspective of all of these practices and gestures, and the way they have been named as well and tagged, and in a way trying to be put into words by other people, which is also something that I found very powerful, especially since these kind of practices are, let's say, in a way, horizontally crossing or traversing through several areas of society. So that's like the third layer to it, like the external perspective and the external view. And in the end, what I realized is that what we were looking into was actually a non-linear history of the development as well of the internet and the surrounding technologies that allow for this internet to grow and move and become the monster that it has become today. And the ways that we can still reappropriate part of these tools to, at least for some moments, some minutes, some hours, some days even, get some of this space back into our hands and make something with it, which is something that I found very, very powerful, especially in times like this. You can see over here also some of the images of what happened physically at Centro de Cultura Digital. So I was also very much aware that having an online exhibition in a way limits the kind of audience that can approach this kind of artwork and the conversations that are being held there. So what I propose to have back here physically, let's say on the spot, was to have this poster that you are going to see also on the gallery space, which was designed by Nicolas Franchi, which is part of like what was like a very internal, I guess, like sort of like an internal joke, which is this book that pops up at this film that talks actually about like this dystopian future and the way that migrant work would be developed in, let's say, the near future by Alex Rivera, where this book pops up at just a couple of seconds. That's called Hackear para Principiantes. And in this film, it says that it was written by R. Dominguez. So, so it was, of course, like this very small detail on the film that was looking into all of these other gestures and practices that were tied to a different area of production, but that were, of course, a symbol of how these conversations can be held from these gestures. So we created a diagram here of online action, and then Nicolas designed this poster that we printed on a very big piece of cloth and held it outside of Centro de Cultura Digital. Then we started, placing the paper posters all around the Centro de Cultura Digital, and of course all of the spots that we could find that were actually looking into the street, so that we could try and activate other kind of interventions and interactions with what was happening online. Later on, when we could open for a little while physically the Centro de Cultura Digital, we started doing other kind of activations, which one of them was a guided tour where actually Ricardo Sierra, my collaborator over here, had this half commented tour in regards to specifically FloodNet, but then also it was like a small experimental protest. So the attendees for this guided tour at some point became performers themselves. And what we did is that we went onto the streets with these kind of messages. This one right here that says "No se preocupen, venimos del internet." It says, "Don't worry, we're coming from the internet. We come from the internet." So what we did here is that Ricardo Sierra over here took us to this series of buildings that represent different levels and areas of power, so political power, but also economic power, because the Centro de Cultura Digital is pretty much surrounded by what we could name the new financial area in Mexico City. And we started talking about what does all of this mean and reconnecting back to what was happening online. And it was also a way we found to be together when developing all of this and having these kind of conversations that were happening on the spot, which I also thought was very interesting and which afterwards led to a performance that we presented at Museo Carrillo Gil and that we will be presenting, like Ricardo Dominguez said, as a conversion here on May the 19th. Trying to build also a case for weaving back and forth the online and offline spaces, the on-screen and off-screen spaces, and getting also, let's say, an expanded sense of what all of this could mean as a tool of being together, and then again as a tool for creating and developing this radical collectiveness. And then just finally, I want to share a little bit about a book that we created, part of this research, but then also activating and inviting other researchers and artists and curators to think about what could be seen from the present time and the present moment within these gestures, and how can we put that into words nowadays, especially nowadays when the internet feels like 100 years old, and these, let's say, 90s internet that allowed for a lot of other conversations and activations to happen is not there anymore. However, we can still find these, like I said, these smaller areas where we can, for a moment, pop in, pop out, activate, and just, in a way, refuse to move and refuse to work in the ways that these structures ask us to work and move and produce. This is a book that is available online. If you want to go on to the Centro de Cultura Digital website, you can download it there. And we had the participation and collaboration by Amy Sarah Carroll, Critical Art Ensemble, Ricardo Dominguez, of course, Cecilia Castañeda, Gaby Cepeda, Aria Dean, Timothy Murray, Mariana Botey. Hola Mariana, I know you were there. Sean Hisley, Fernando Monreal, and myself. Where you can see we can go back and forth into several areas of acknowledging and understanding these practices, which were pretty much divided into 3 main areas and 3 other key written projects that were not necessarily part of this, but that in a way found a way to be part of it all simultaneously. So we start with this really beautiful poem, diary that was created by Amy Sarah Carroll that's called Nifty, an intimate oral story, which we had like a very interesting conversation going into the translation of it. Then we go into gestures from within net art, performative matrix, electronic disturbance from within hacktivism, and then a really beautiful interview by Gaby Cepeda with Ricardo Dominguez talking about what are the 2020s if not a massive non-consensual hallucination. This was developed with a lot of effort and a lot of care and a lot of love, especially because we thought it was a key moment in time, not only from within Mexico, but also elsewhere, where we can start having these conversations in regards to what does it mean to move as fast as we have been pushed to move into from within the ways we use technologies, and particularly the internet. And what can we do about it? How can we break free from all of these systems? And what can we propose from these ways of interaction and interacting and activating online, especially after 2020, where we have been, in a way, kidnapped by these rectangular frame. And I just really wanted to present this process with you because it has been something that had been, I don't know, it started to roll and it just keep on rolling and rolling and rolling. And this is something that I really appreciate, because instead of thinking about accelerating or making more in a faster manner, I guess what we are actually doing here is slowing down and refusing to work in the times and frames that these systems propose. So I think that in a way that has been what we have been developing in the past years, and that I hope that we keep on developing. And yeah, that's me.
Gracias.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, gracias. Now I'd like to bring up my longtime collaborator for, 20 plus years, Professor Stahlbaum, founder of multiple groups himself, and a serial collaborator, I think you often say. My own personal technological Thoreau that lives and breathes nature and technology, both at the same time. And none of these co-creative works could have been done without the deep thought and process that Brett has brought to the community. Gracias, Brett. Here you go.
Hey.
Abrazos. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Congratulations to you.
So it's been 2 years since I've hooked this computer up to HDMI. I wonder if it's still going to work. Hey, look at that. Good evening, everybody. I'm Brett Stahlbaum. I'm a teaching faculty member, a teaching professor in the Department of Visual Arts here at UC San Diego. And it's been, one of the highlights of my career to be involved in various projects with Ricardo. So the first thing I want to do tonight is congratulate Ricardo and also Doreen and also Mariana Botte and Amy Sarah Carroll and others who have worked academically in trying to understand how we assess this kind of collective practice in a field, and particularly visual arts, that still tends to celebrate, sort of individual creative genius in a time when, the development of post-industrial society is just really, really so much beyond the effects of individuals. It's been, my great pleasure to work with all of these great people and to work in a really, really progressive visual arts department who understands these problems. I really wanted to say congratulations, especially Doreen, for mounting this exhibition and dealing with these problems, and, of course, and all of the authors who participated in this book, because I think it really is like a kind of it's one of the just better kind of approaches in terms of both deep research and assembly of materials and collecting the understanding and staging the understanding that's necessary to understand this kind of collective work. I think it's a great accomplishment, and I want to acknowledge that. So here's the only good. In fact, the irony of my career is I don't even identify as a visual artist in many senses. I'm more of a punk technologist, I think, in terms of my history. That's how I see myself. But I did manage to take this one great picture during my lifetime. One day when Ricardo and I were, exploring along the actual edges of the border wall near Calexico. This is just one of the many times, in fact, I feel like I've gotten Ricardo in trouble. I'll admit to that. But I see a border patrol car down the way, and I said, "Oh, come on, we got to go take a picture of you in front of that car." And the agent realized that there was somebody behind her car just at the moment that I took the picture, and she came. She wasn't happy with us. I could tell you the rest of the story. It's not bad. It just, it was minor trouble, good trouble that day, I think. And what Ricardo asked me to talk about tonight was specifically the electronic disturbance theater projects, the two major projects that we've done in the past. So I was in graduate school when this started. I was, there was social media, believe it or not, in the 1990s. Nobody believes me when I say that, but it was called email lists. In fact, somebody else here tonight I'd like to acknowledge was running an email list at this time, Professor Jordan Crandall. Jordan, where are you? There he is. Hey. Jordan was in New York at the time running an email list, an experimental email list that was taking, that was a really kind of an interesting sort of theoretical departure, a place where theory could be discussed among a broad group of people that were early adopters on the internet and doing interesting things around all of the questions that appeared and that we still live with around networking and networks. And Ricardo was on that list. I was on that list. Discussions were taking place, and Ricardo he actually forwarded an email from an Italian activist group called the Federation for Random Action that had proposed as part of Zapatista activism that everybody go to the website of the president of Mexico and click the reload button in the browser over and over again. And I said, hey, it's just an email conversation. Ricardo, this is a great idea. I was writing a lot of network software then, particularly client-side, embedded. Nobody's going to know what that means, but it was basically a thing called Java applets, which is a Web 1.0 thing. Now, those of you that are web developers have been ensconced in, JavaScript and document object model and things like that for a long time, CSS. Well, this was really was a different internet, and the idea of a Java applet was it was simply a small program that could be embedded inside of a web page that could do things to the web page. JavaScript was a thing at the time, and it won. But this was something that people were very excited about at the time. So you wouldn't know where it was in this web page, but it's actually in the upper left-hand corner, the picture of President Ernesto Zedillo, who we were protesting against, is being displayed by an applet there. And what happens in the web page was, well, first of all, this is also something that's kind of going back in time and explaining the way things were. Much like when I teach some of my classes, I have to explain to my students that I grew up with 3 television channels. Nobody can believe it, right? But so this is a little bit like that. There were actually these things called frames in HTML that are no longer legitimate HTML, but it allowed you to divide the screen up and display different web pages inside of each one of those frames. It's a very old-timey HTML idea that doesn't exist anymore. But having been studying this stuff and taking classes and working on projects in graduate school, I knew technically that I could do this. And so I said, hey, Ricardo, what do you think? And he said, sure, show me something. And I sent him a website, and he said, it looks terrible. And that's because I'm really not a visual artist. I'm a designer, but I think I choose red as a background color everywhere. It did truly look terrible. So Ricardo invited Carmen Karasik to come in and work with me. She's an engineer, so she really knew how to put all of the different parts together, and we really worked together to create the web pages for this. And really all that applet did was kind of operate as the finger that reloaded different websites in the 3 frames at the bottom. This is from the September 9th performance at Ars Electronica. That year the theme was InfoWar. And we directed our virtual sit-in technology. There's an important distinction there to make. I'll get to it. But we directed our virtual sit-in technology against the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, the president of Mexico, Ernesto Zedillo's site, and also the Pentagon in that case. And you can see from the screenshot, I don't remember which one we had loading in the right frame, but it actually overwhelmed that website. There were too many users. You can see the pop-up there saying that, that one of the pages was not working. So this performance successfully overwhelmed the server of, I believe it was the president of Mexico in that instance, but you can also see, web pages loading slowly. That would be indexed by, the missing image, the missing file image there, that, not all of the HTML or documents were able to be loaded successfully from across the web. So, an important distinction to make, the difference between what later became, we didn't really use the term distributed denial of service attack at this time. At least I was unfamiliar with it. I'm sure some were. But this was sort of a version of that, except that instead of hacking into a bunch of different computers and turning them into an army of robot computers to attack a third-party website, and we made this really, really clear on the website that people were contributing their individual IP address collectively to a collective protest that's akin to a sit-in, not akin to a distributed denial of service attack, even though they obviously have some kind of similar characteristics at the time. And a bunch of investigations came from that. only having 15 minutes, I particularly this book on the left, if you can find it, Internet Art by Rachel Green. I think it was also one of the authors in the book that you can get for free in the gallery right now. Does a really good laconic job of explaining a lot and contextualizing a lot of the events that took place around this time in 1998. But there are also some other images of earlier versions of the website. Here you can see, we did a bunch of different projects. There was a port scanning tool. There was a time in the history of internet security when port scanning was considered to be a hostile activity. So of course that was this time, and of course we created a tool to port scan sites and put messages into the packets, like organized messages into the packets that were doing the scanning to send messages to sites. And one of the versions of the project let people send their own messages into the error logs. That was a technique that we were using that maybe I'll get back to a little bit later if there's time. Maybe I'll show you if I have a chance, I'll show an illegal website where some of these ideas actually came from, emerged from, kind of in the context of both electronic disturbance theater and the graduate program that I was part of, the Cadre Digital Media Laboratory, which was the first sort of formal MFA program in computing in the arts in the United States. Second project that I'll sort of describe technically is the Transborder Immigrant Tool and where those ideas came from. The Transborder Immigrant Tool was, pre-iPhone, and in fact, previous to there was a phone called the Sidekick that had an app store before Apple did, but it wasn't very widely adopted. And the phones that we were interested in working with were very, very low-cost phones. In fact, that's kind of important, and the fact that we were really interested in working with really, really low-cost technology and writing software for low-cost technology that allowed it to do something that its designers didn't intend it to do, which has been sort of a guiding principle that we learned early on from a scholar by the name of Dorothy Denning, who was a cybersecurity scholar who defined the role of hackers, she tried to define what a hacker was or who a hacker was by saying that a hacker is somebody who makes systems do things that their designers didn't intend them to do. She was trying to, at this time in the 1990s, really trying to divert from the sort of the evil hacker or hacker as a necessarily and obviously criminal person away toward an assessment of a more creative notion of what computer hacking was. And we hooked onto that idea early, and we've also always had, I think, at least in electronic disturbance theater, an interest in the lower end of technology and the near antiquated technologies, because those are the things that become $10 on eBay that you can have a lot of fun with. You can buy a lot of computers for $10 or a lot of drones for $10 if you're willing to put up, if you don't want to, if you're not going to, play along with the sort of technological determinism of the most recent version and the most capabilities. I think as artists, if we can abandon that, you can find, a lot of things that you can do very, very interesting things with, and that becomes a different kind of scale when you can acquire, for example, $10, in this case, the attraction was $10 mobile phones that we thought we might be able to distribute to people to help them find water during the act of crossing into the United States. So that's what it did. We used a GPS metaphor. We wrote the software. You can see sort of a dramatized version of this, well, to a degree dramatized, of what the user interface actually looked like in the gallery. But yeah, you would take the phone out. It would point you to a water resource. Literally, as you walked along, it would find you the closest one, point you in that direction, and if you got that arrow to point to the direction of that, then eventually you would arrive at the site. And as software, just as kind of a software project I was involved in my life, I'm really proud of this because the shit really worked. We could turn somebody loose in the desert, blindfolded, didn't know where they were, and they would find one of these stations using this phone. And it even had some really interesting features to, once you had some kind of basic training on the phone had a lot of haptic features and other features that It was much more than you see in the images of it in terms of how the phone and its audio operating system would help guide people toward the site. Now, who inspired this and what were the water sites? I'm going to put in an important plug here. One of the groups that we naturally were inspired in all of this by a variety of different water groups, water activist groups who put water on the US-Mexico border. And one of the ones we spoke to first was Water Stations. That was founded by Dr. John Hunter and has been operated by Laura Hunter and a board of directors as a proper nonprofit corporation for close to 20 years now, over 20 years now. And this is a really, really important group. If you want to look this up, make a donation. I'm still active with it. It's volunteers that go out with the region the sector that we cover is the San Diego Imperial County border area, different places where people cross along there, and we place water in these barrels. You can kind of see what the volunteer activity looks like there. And, if anybody's interested in experiencing this as a volunteer, please talk to me. I put my email address on the bottom of the page here. I'm happy to sort of help facilitate, volunteers who want to go out with us and help service these stations. We go every 2 weeks to check each and every one of them and make sure that, the water that's been used is being replaced and things like that. So we spoke with them and the funny thing about the connection with water stations is they thought that what we were doing was the worst idea. And in fact, I think still do. And that they gave us some very, very practical advice that guided us in developing the software for the project. And we learned so much from them. And that's turned into, for me and my wife, Paula Poole, that's turned into we've volunteered with them on a regular basis ever since. A lot of the main problem with actually distributing the tool became, the fact that it's a criminal enterprise, a lot of it. The people that run the human trafficker organizations don't really invite people to come in and talk and help facilitate crossers. They're actually rather hostile to outsiders, these criminal organizations that do much of the human trafficking across the border. So, we found out at some point that we were never actually going to be able to distribute these, but they did nevertheless create the kind of disturbance in the media space, the prospect that this thing was possible. We were featured on Fox News, Glenn Beck's program at the time, received, this is all pre-Trump and even pre-Tea Party, but we got the same kinds of death threats and stalking events and things like that taking place. As Ricardo alluded to, 3 Republican congressmen in the area became involved. The president of this university, or the chancellor of this university, became involved in trying to fire Ricardo. And there was interference in tenure cases that affected Amy Sarah Carroll very much, and all kinds of really, really very serious consequences occurred from this. And I'm just proud of my colleagues for their tenacity in carrying on, and they suffered actually a great deal for this project, and it's something that I think needs acknowledged very much. So anyway, it's a response to our broken immigration system and our racist immigration system, and an immigration system that is really designed to kill a few people so a lot of people can come work for Foster Farms and Tyson Foods, and we can have an endless supply of informal labor. It was a study, I believe, out of GPS here at UCSD a couple of years ago that determined that most people are successful in crossing by the 3rd time, like 95%. So the border wall was not and never was about, border security in at least in the sense of preventing people from coming to the United States. And if you think about it, that's a really, really, really hard thing to do on such a long border, and given that there's a Pacific Ocean and people know what boats are, and they're some upwards of some 40% of people who are in the United States without authorization came in first class or coach and overstayed a visa. So, a lot of the border wall, of course, just doesn't make any sense at all, except as kind of a political wall in which we're going to go through a ritual of killing a small number of people so that we can nevertheless allow the labor to come and have a very, very pliable labor force that's, susceptible to wage theft and kind of operates outside of labor laws in the United States. So, as I equally criticize both of our major political parties for participating in this murderous sham. What is this? Can anybody tell me what this is? Yes.
It's a shoe.
It's a shoe. And this is sort of one of the technological inspirations for electronic disturbance theater, is really low tech, understanding low tech, understanding situated technologies. Immigrants, when they're crossing, will bring these pieces of foam with them. One of the Border Patrol tactics is to drag, it's called a drag strip, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture of it, but basically they pull things behind their vehicles that smooth out the sands, particularly around Highway 98. If you come out and volunteer with Water Station, for which we would be very, very grateful because we do need the help and the physical labor to deliver this water, you'll get to see some evidence of sort of the Border Patrol tactics. And one of the things immigrants will do is, after the Border Patrol smooths out the land, they'll use these slippers to walk across that part of the dirt path and not leave footprints. So there's also these kind of escalation of technologies, high and low, that are constantly taking place in this context. So anyway, this is kind of what the, some slides on just what the different states of the tool were. I don't think that it's that important to show you all of this. I think I'm getting pretty close on time too. So, but the video does do a pretty nice job here of sort of like, as you turn, the needle turns. When you turn the screen green, that's when you're heading toward the site. The user interface would show people how far it was in kilometers and meters to arrive there. And, that's sort of the practical use of the tool. And again, sort of following this, this design idea of, writing software for a platform that does something that the designers of the platform really didn't intend it to do, is sort of one of our guiding principles in electronic disturbance theater. And Amy's going to be up next to talk about some ways. Usually when I give the longer version of this talk, I play a lot of the poetry, but I'm going to forego that because we have the expert here tonight to show us and demonstrate that in a much better way than I think my little videos do. Another document that came out of the experience of this is a timeline of how UC San Diego tried to take Professor Dominguez's tenure away from him. And I don't have time to go into all of the details in this, but to make a long story short, the university had first had hired Ricardo because of in part, and it's in the file letters and everything, his work on electronic disturbance theater and FloodNet, promoted him to tenure in a file which included electronic disturbance theater and FloodNet and writing about its importance. And then Ricardo used a variant of FloodNet much later against one unit of the university, and suddenly this was a reason to fire Professor Dominguez. So the real practical consequences of this even ended up at the level of the file letter, right? Where in the past file letter, this practice is being lauded, and in the very next, phase of, the very next phase of the career, which in this case was an attempt to actually remove Professor Dominguez's tenure, it was suddenly a bad thing. And it's really, really interesting to me, like as one of the legacies of this, is just how clueless our administration was at the time. Not even, not even bothering to read the previous file letters that, in the case of one individual, that individual had signed the file letter. It was his signature on the letter, saying we should promote Professor Dominguez to tenure because this work is important. And then participated most heavily in trying to remove him from his position for exactly the same thing. So, again, what I want to pass this on to Amy so that we can explore the poetic dimension of all of this. But I really want to just very much congratulate my colleague and friend, Professor Ricardo Dominguez, for this work. And it's really overdue attention to this kind of practice. So congratulations, sir. Congratulations.
Yeah, I survived the FBI and everybody, huh? And now they made me chair to pay for all that badness. That's what you get for.
Punishment always comes.
Yeah, that's what you get for being a bad person. You end up being chair. I'm not sure. So now I would like to bring up as the final speaker for the evening is Professor Amy Sarah Carroll in the literature department, experimental poet, scholar, and now my machine, of course, is not letting me in. Hold on, Amy. Let me bring this up. So I'm very lucky to have worked with many poets, and among the most important is Amy Sarah Carroll. And when we started the Transporter Immigrant Tool, it was to move away from a global positioning system to what became a geopoetic system. And so poetry became a key element in the aesthetic. And when we started this project with Doreen, we started thinking about poetry as a way to tell the story of our development as a community, as a family, as my amor. They hear these stories all the time. And then we decided to turn them into NFTs just for the fun of it. So let me invite Professor Amy Sarah Carroll up here. And if you'll pick up the screen, if you will. Hold on. Yay!
Oh, thank you.
Yeah?
Brad, are these yours?
Yeah, I'll give it to him.
Okay, let me see here. Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Okay. I'm going to disappoint you because I'm not going to read anything from the TBT. I'm going to read from these NFTs. NFT, 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 50. Question: what do you call 210 NFTs? Answer: nifty. Alternative answer: to be continued. Fall 2019, Doreen, then chief curator at Mexico City Centro de Cultura Digital, invited me to contribute an essay to a catalog slated to accompany the exhibition. ¿Cuánto tiempo lleva todo esto derramándose sin desbordarse? I had written catalog essays previously. Doreen and I had been in conversation about the show for months. Still, I hesitated to contribute to the catalog. I'm just going to have to take these masks off because this is really getting in the way. It's fogging up the glasses. Sorry. Cuánto Tiempo focuses on a retro collective. Cuánto Tiempo focuses on decades of collaborative work by my partner, Ricardo Dominguez. It includes artwork that we produced together in EDT 2.0 and Particle Group. In short, I could maintain no pretext of objectivity relative to his work. Following COVID-19's virtual reconfiguration of Cuánto Tiempo, in dialogue with Doreen and Ricardo, I proposed an alternative. Nifty, una historia oral íntima, includes 50 poems that I wrote over the haunted summer of 2021. I say haunted summer in reference to the April 1816 eruption of Mount Tambora that blanketed the planet in ash and landed Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, among others, on Lake Geneva. Lord Byron challenged his companions to compose scary stories. Soon to be Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in response. While Nifty does not compare to Frankenstein, it is a monstrous text dedicated to Ricardo, Doreen, and Zay Carol Dominguez, Ricardo and my son. I completed it in English against the backdrop of the Delta surge in the first half of one of the only summers that I haven't traveled to Mexico. In the next month and a half, Doreen and I went back and forth on the collection's Spanish translation, involving Ricardo and others in the process. At the same time, Ricardo, Zay, and I were relocating within San Diego. As we packed to move, unearthing all manner of memory, Ricardo went into a studio each day to sort through his archive for Doreen. Late afternoons, he would return with a photograph, a handmade book, a story of 1982, 1999, or you can fill in the blank. Many of his accounts organically made their way into Nifty per the project's subtitle. Conterminously, we were following the year's NFT craze. Somewhere between the earnest and undocumentary playfulness of Ricardo's artivist practice and the transdisciplinary space of new media and e-poetics, we hatched our own collaborative versus competitive group challenge. Fall 2021, every day leading up to the opening of Cuánto Tiempo, we minted and set adrift on the open sea one of Nifty's poems. Our aims to work with and against the zany, cute, and disinteresting aesthetics of NFT in the spirit of Cyan Nye. To count down the exhibition's launch, November 2021, we presented a performative lecture of the project as one of the exhibition's inaugural events. December 2021, the poems were published in the catalog under a Creative Commons license. Throughout, we sought to experiment with various modes of reauthoring and distributing Nifty, approaching the collection as an extension of and an artwork pertinent to Cuánto Tiempo. Per Ricardo's request, I'll read a few of the project's NFTs to you now. Okay, let's see. There we go. 1. Summer 2001, Monterrey, Mexico, black ski mask, booming baritone, Ricardo René Dominguez, RRD, speaks of resistance from below, of Maya technology and inefficient code, of a stick thrown into the air to down artillery aircraft. 2. ASC, why lean on into autobiography, RRD, listen for Brecht's amplification, a triangulation of almost me, almost not me, and almost another me. 4. Graciela Cecilia Dominguez, 1917 through 2005, is born on a ranch near Delicias, Chihuahua, the youngest child of Pancho Villa's assistant treasurer. 10 of her older brothers are killed in the Mexican Revolution. 2 brothers, her sister, and she survive. In her 20s, she studies theater in Mexico City. When she begins to date a chemistry teacher, she switches majors and completes a medical degree. When their relationship ends, I'd add because he wouldn't leave his wife, she moves to Ciudad Juarez, crosses into El Paso, relocates to Las Vegas's Glitter Gulch. RRD on collaboration. I never work alone. My favorite configurations, the anarchist 5. 6. Fabulation begins where memory fails. 9. RRD. My mother worked nights as a truck driver, as a casino shill dressed to the nines in a pathology lab. Magazines arrived to our apartment addressed to Ricardo Dominguez. Mom fined me $1 whenever I spoke English at home. Afuera de la casa, the tables turned. When we went to see scary movies, for every caramba y Dios míos, I heard cha-ching. 10. In Sissu's novel Hyper Dream, the narrator falls asleep in Benjamin's bed, develops a relationship with another entity, maybe Benjamin's ghost, with whom she plays a game of echoes, listening for the suture and alloy of citation. Does Secret Citations describe the whole of the communication between the pair, or the dynamic in which one, then the other, invokes an author sans attribution for the other's pleasure to decipher? Conversations with RRD proceed as such. (15) RRD co-founds Critical Art Ensemble, a collective of art workers. Between 1987 and 1995, with CAE, he coordinates actions with ACT UP Tallahassee, tours BBQ restaurants in Florida and Georgia, performs interpretations of Deleuze and Guattari's Body Without Organs. From Gibson's Neuromancer to Genet's The Balcony, CAE reads and writes promiscuously, developing a method of utopian plagiarism. In short, take a line from another text, replace some of its keywords, augment its turns of phrase, e.g., civil disobedience becoming electronic civil disobedience, or nifty as an NFT, a thing.net like you and me. As other members of CAE gravitate towards bioart, RRD resolves to catapult ECD from theory to practice. Summer 1991, after RRD and his wife part ways amicably, he buys a used Ford Fiesta and a new pair of boots, packs 50 books, drives to New York City, parks the car on Greenwich Street, and removes its plates. In the time it takes him to carry his books up to his 4th floor Christopher Street rented room, the car's back window is smashed in and his new boots stolen. Wandering the East Village, he finds a black leather jacket in a garbage can. Think Marlon Brando, the wild one. RRD, the city taketh, the city giveth. 17, Lower East Side, Stairway to Heaven, circa 1993, Graciela Dominguez also rocking the black leather jacket. (20) What were the 1990s, if not a hyper dream? (23) At Ars Electronica 1998 and Linz, Austria, EDT's commitments to digital transparency are repeatedly tested. The phone rings, an anonymous caller warns RRD not to stage swarm a virtual sit-in against the Mexican government, ominously embellishing, "Sabemos dónde ustedes están y dónde ustedes viven." RRD, sí como no lo saben, nosotros mismos pusimos esta información en línea. Hippies from Hell, a group of Dutch hackers whose work also appears in the festival, threatened to shut down Swarm on the grounds that it's digitally incorrect. The U.S. Department of Defense launches the first known information war weapon against Swarm in violation of the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. Stefan needs a drink. Artmark needs more artivist gestures on its stock exchange. Stefan sells Floodnet to Artmark for a 6-pack of beer. '27 RRD. September 1999, EDT presented at the National Security Agency, NSA, in Fort Meade outside of Bethesda, Maryland. As I recounted the tale of Mayan technology, Godard's Alphaville streamed behind me. Post-presentation, the Department of Defense testified before the U.S. Senate. If Floodnet isn't illegal, it was certainly immoral. '30. Net worth of nodes. Nifty is and is not un pomario, a conversation piece, a durational performance aspirationally orbiting, un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos. Trusted readers of an earlier version of Nifty comment that unsure of what an NFT is, they waited in vain for the acronymic slip of NAFTA into NFT in the English. To wit, I wonder, what is an NFT but NAFTA's continued contraction and expansion, the currency of exchange distilled in the labored language of digital singularity? ASC, would you help me have a child? RRD, would you help me have a child? 32. 33. In 2005, RRD participates in a faculty show. His contributions include Plays Well with Others, a diagram of his collaborations, and a Gonzalez Torres-style hacktivism manuscript jubilee. Slated to be published by Autonomedium, hacktivism never appears in print. Its electronic version also disappears. The paper copy in RRD's possession is missing to date its introduction. Please contact Gallery QI if you have a complete copy of Hacktivism. I'm going to read just a couple more of these. They're all in the gallery, so you can look at them if you want. Needless to say, we didn't sell any, really, on the open sea. 40, Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0, RRD, me, Brett, Misha, Ellie, Anza Borrego, State Park, in collaboration with Water Stations, Inc. and Border Angels. 3 congressional representatives contact UCSD and the University of Michigan to demand a full accounting of funds used on TBT, accuse EDT 2.0 of aiding and abetting illegal entry into the U.S. FBI agents, could we ask you a few questions? Auditor 1, how many hours of work time have you devoted to this project, RRD? How to quantify where work begins and life ends. Auditor 2, what do you mean by dislocative media? RRD, for every location, it's dislocation. Auditor 3, what is queer theory? RRD, why don't you audit a course on the topic? I think I'm going to end with this one. Am I at 15 minutes? Okay, one more. Let me just go to this last one. 45, RRD, no retrospectives. Museo Universitario Arte Contemporáneo, UNAM, 2016. Mónica Mayer, si tiene dudas, pregunte. ASC, a retro collective, perhaps? Thank you.
Gracias, amor. So I don't know, we don't have a lot of time, but if you have any questions for any of us, please raise your hand or come up to the speaker if you guys want to go over there for a moment. And then we'll have food and drink, and you can take a book in the gallery if you wish. Yeah, if you have any questions or anything, and then we'll finish the gestures. We know who you are, so goodbye. Yeah? Maybe we're all good. Any questions among yourselves? You survived? You're still here? Yeah?
Thanks for so many people coming out tonight.
Yeah,
thank you so much. We appreciate
everybody.
it.
I appreciate it. Well, yes, question? Do you want to ask up here? Yeah? Yeah.
All right, one thing I find very compelling is the kind of the automation, but also refusal to automate of the electronic civil disobedience. And so I just wanted to hear more about the pleasures of collaboration, the political potency of collective action, as it's played through some of your collaborations over the years. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. Well, one of the elements that was really important for FloodNet, electronic civil disobedience, was this constant use of the browser that was a new entity at that time, was that we could use it to investigate the public agora of one component which was beyond the reload, which was 404 files, or files not found. And so this was a way to create electronic disturbance, in that we often imagine that cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber crime were about infiltrating into the core of a database, into a security zone. But what the system of the virtual sit-in did was activate the territory of the Mexican government or the DoD or the Frankfurt Stock Exchange by asking simple questions. Does justice exist on this Mexican government website? The website would respond 404, justice not found on this Mexican government website, or democracy. So it was a kind of negative dialectics, in that it basically extracted what did not exist within the governmental zone. Not the secret, but the apparent missing data. And so part of the performative matrix was also collaborating in deciding the aesthetics in the 1990s, which was around anonymity. The way AOL would sell online culture was, in cyberspace, nobody knows you're a dog or a cat. Anonymity was the selling of early 90s communication. So Brett, Carmen, and Stefan were discussing what is the relationship of data bodies and real bodies in relationship to electronic civil disobedience. And so we decided, much against the grain of the time, to be transparent, so that the aesthetics of transparency, of uniting data bodies and real bodies in a kind of Gandhian Sayagraha, right? In the streets, the police can come hit you. So how do you do that online? So Brett and Carmen, we got together and developed a way in which you could see, just by viewing source, what the code was. We would let people know where we lived, our telephone numbers, when we were going to do the action. So as Amy's poem points out, when the Mexican government called us in Linz and said, we know who you are, we know where you live, we know what you're going to do, we said,
Yeah.
Of course, we told you. We sent out an email saying, this is what we're doing. So
you're going to have to work on your script.
Yeah, so transparency was part of that collaborative question, which developed an intense dialogue because it went against the grain of that particular 90s aesthetic. So I think that allows both for a performative matrix of the collaborative dialogue, the misalignment of a platform or tool that goes against its own conditions, if you will, and what allows us then to have a conversation with different nodes of power in a very direct way, rather than in an anonymous way as that the system was being sold at that time.
I think that speaks to the question very, very well. I don't have anything to add.
Well, I guess I would add one thing, and I'm not sure you were actually asking this, but I heard part of your question, and thank you for the question. It was layered about the process of collaboration. And I think collaboration is so key because we're all bringing different things to these projects. And so what it means to, we're greater than our own skill sets by combining forces and thinking through ideas together. And I think so often we're encouraged within academic spaces not to collaborate, or within the arts and humanities at least. I think there's a different kind of perspective on it in the sciences or even sometimes in the social sciences. But to collaborate is really, it becomes a way of thinking out loud with one another and completing each other's sentences. And around ideas like electronic civil disobedience, it becomes so key for our pushing each other to think outside of boxes or frames or, the rectangle of the screen. I'm not sure if that was in your question, but I heard it somehow.
I was going to say one of the mantras that we had with Critical Art Ensemble was collaboration, a total disaster. So. All right. Well, we should maybe have food or Doreen. Yeah, gracias.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Gracias. Gracias everybody. Oh, there's somebody else?
Quickly.
I want to go eat, I guess.
Sorry. Oh my gosh, sorry. Thank you all so much. Your work has always been a huge inspiration. And I was thinking, hearing about lost manuscripts, seeing screenshots of outmoded, kinds of web coding protocols. I guess my question is about how you collectively, distributively approach or think about or discuss, the question of memory and archiving and the longevity of some of these, works and practices.
We discuss it a lot. It fixes nothing. With the current project, this is probably the last time that you're going to see a public display of the project as it was written for at least a particular generation of really, really inexpensive Motorola phones that inspired us for the first time. They're literally dissolving in some cases. Literally the rubber and the plastic is falling apart on these devices 20 years later. So there really isn't going to be a platform to continue to show those. It was all written in a Java API called J2ME, which was a distant predecessor to, what Apple started doing in 2007. Recently we went to try to reactivate some of the phones, and we can't even compile the software anymore because of an unknown problem with the integrated development environment that we were using to compile the code. It does compile, it does produce a binary. The phone, for some reason, the phones don't accept the binary anymore. So even on the development side, things have broken. It's not just the physical devices that are growing old or wearing out. And I was having a good conversation with a couple of the preparators and gallery sitters who are students here at UCSD doing really interesting work and looking after the gallery, talking about this problem. And it's a huge area. It's not a huge area, but it's an important area in which there are actually a limited number of really, really important experts in terms of, digital preservation. And I don't think we have a clear answer to it, other than, maybe try to use some more contemporary technologies to sort of restage. The work that Doreen did on part of this is, in fact, a kind of restaging of some of the earlier, graphics, semiotics, and sound for a more contemporary platform. But what I think we might agree about, though, is like what we're really interested in is getting around a table and playing with some new cheap toys and seeing what we can make those do and moving forward, rather than trying to. We've maybe been quite lackadaisical about preservation because, I think I speak for my colleagues. It's like next project is sort of an instinct of ours.
Thank you for your question. Oh, I'm not sure. I was going to say that we're so grateful to Doreen for. Doreen, were you about to say something? I can tell, but Doreen's work was so key in terms of trying to think about how to put the work together. So I'll let her speak.
I just wanted to add some ideas that I've very recently started researching a bit about in terms of digital preservation, and especially the preservation of gestures that happen in a particular context throughout time. And I came across this idea regarding the dynamic archive, which I really, really liked, because it pretty much points out to preserving the memories in terms of stories and let's say a testimonial approach to it, and not necessarily just looking into a way of preserving the objects or even the content, because they apply in different ways throughout time, and especially with something that is so fastly changing as the technologies that we use nowadays, that are, well, actually designed for them to eventually stop working, all of these notions regarding the planned obsolescence and so forth. But this idea of the dynamic archive, I think it is very powerful, especially when we think about creating and developing, series of nets and networks from within people and actual agents that were present, who can share, sort of like going back in time and thinking about the ways in which a lot of stories were passed throughout generations. It's the same idea behind the dynamic archive. And I think that could be something that also enhances the notion of creating collectively and weaving collectively these stories, instead of thinking necessarily only about the objects, and the physicality of these objects. So I don't know, I think that's just something that I very recently came across, and I thought it was very powerful, particularly for this kind of networked actions.
Yeah, well, I would say that the hacktivism book that's in the gallery that you can take is a type of dynamic archive, in that it's a multitude of communities who are having dialogues around electronic civil disobedience, software art, hacktivism. Individuals like Professor Amy Alexander is there. So it's this wide swath of a particular moment at the end of 1999, and so I think that might meet that kind of oral story. I guess in terms of archive, one day at my studio I heard a knock, and I opened the door, and there were these two young men all dressed in white, and I went to school in southern Utah, so I thought they were Mormon missionaries, and I was surprised. I hadn't seen Mormon missionaries in a while. And they said, "Are you Ricardo Dominguez?" I said, "Yes." And they gave me a little card, and it said, "The Smithsonian Latin American Archive." And they said, "Can we talk to you?" And I said, "Sure." And they sat down and said, "Ricardo, you are on a list of artists who are probably going to die pretty soon. And our job is to try to get you archived before you die." And I was going, "Gosh, do you guys know something about my, end of life that perhaps, you should let me know?" And they said, "No, we keep track of these things." And I said, well, okay. And they said, look, your archive is desired by 3 different archives. One is in Houston, and if you give your archive to the one in Houston, you will always be known as a Latin American artist. There is another archive in Southern California that wants your work, but if you give it to them, you will only be known as a California artist, or a Chicano artist, Chicanx. But if you give it to the Smithsonian, you will be known as an American artist. And I said, you mean a dead American artist? And so anyway, that's where the conversation ended. But I think that's, again, how do archive fevers function? And what happens in archive fever when the objects themselves are not really the key condition of the work? As I like to say to my students, along with Brett, the work that we have done always navigates the future ruins yet to come. So the work is always produced on platforms that are already in ruins, that are already disassembling. So there has to be other ways for these gestures to be sutured into the conversation, and they could be memory pieces, remembered pieces, confabulations sometimes, and certainly a dynamic archive might be part of that.
Yeah, I would finally just add that, like, the way Ricardo tells these stories, that was really what inspired this, like, these spoof NFTs, right? Because it seems to me that so much of the work is also the oral or storytelling component, as Doreen is gesturing to. So it was a little bit about trying to preserve some of these quirky stories of him when I was writing those this summer.
Yeah, then sometimes they never believe me.
No,
that these things happen to me, right? Like
that's
number
well, 36.
Like one time I told them that when I was in Williamsburg, at the Williamsburg Diner where all the net artists hung out, somebody came up and said, we're going to teleport this whole diner to Stockholm. And we want you guys, as the people who eat here, as the artists, we're going to fly the cooks, everybody, to Stockholm, and your job is just to party for 24 hours in this simulated diner. And it's a long story, but they said, that's no way. Then they were reading Elizabeth Bishop's art history, wasn't it?
Claire Bishop.
Claire Bishop's, what is it, what's it called? The book, No More Room in Hell?
No,
Artificial Hells.
Artificial Hells. Anyway, it's in it. So they said, oh, well, Ricardo must be remembering something that actually happened. Yeah, go ahead.
But you can understand why I didn't believe that story when he was telling it.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for a wonderful talk, Amy and Ricardo and all of you. I was just wondering about how close do you all work with like immigrant people, actual immigrant? Because I feel like there was like a disconnection between that. And I always see it as an actual immigrant person, that there's always work about an immigrant or immigrants, but never the immigrant themselves. So I wonder how, if there's conversations with immigrants, like picking their brain or asking them what they're thinking or what will help us. Yeah, I guess that's the question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question, because part of our design process in 2007 was to then take the transport immigrant tool to Casa Migrante in order to see how they felt that design actually worked and what its uses would be, if any, right, in this kind of caminada across the way. And we spent maybe about 3 years just testing it, making sure that it functioned, right? That it, even Amy, who said, I don't know how to find anything, she used it just to make sure it worked. When we were ready to launch it, we then found ourselves under investigation. And once the FBI and everybody got involved, it became very difficult to move forward. By the time the investigation ended in 2011, the narcotraficante had taken over the informal paths and economy that had been coyotes to a certain degree. And the sense that we got was that if we were to have dispersed the transporter immigrant tool post 2011, we would have placed immigrants in a great deal of danger, to have this kind of unit. So I think it really failed at that particular level. But again, our conceptual trajectory was 3 years of research and then bringing it in to see what they thought of the design and the use. And we never got to it because it all became about the hysteria and paranoia of the North, which is interesting, but it wasn't the link. So I think it's one of the elements of the experiment and the gesture not really meeting its goal, I think.
We had received some feedback even before the media firestorm started that raised questions about whether we would be able to distribute this, given the nature of the trafficking organizations sort of taking over all the paths. So we had heard that it was very unlikely that we were going to be able to distribute this. And we'd started to have some ideas, well, like, do we set this up on the US side of the border for people to use once they've been abandoned? How does that work? And the spaces are just very, very, very large as well. But yeah, things really kind of came to a. I think we were fairly certain from the feedback, for example, from Casa Immigrante and various people that we had shown it to, that nice idea, it's not going to really be practical for these larger economic reasons.
Yeah, so I think it was really a complex element, and we were never able to do that particular gesture for all the reasons that Brett has also mentioned. Amy?
I was going to say that I think this is a really, really important question, and it's it's the moment when the project moved from being an activist gesture to more of an art-based gesture, and one that was taken up by academics and art museums and galleries. But our original intention with this project had not been, even though we were describing it as an art project, as a transformation of the project into a solely conceptual gesture. So I myself hear the unease that you're expressing by way of that question, and have also felt it, because there was a kind of detour that the project took. So one of the ways that we've thought about this project is as a discursive intervention along the lines and within the tradition of border art, where in so many moments the interruption, say, is around discourses relative, say, to immigration. I'm not sure that's enough. I still have the sense that of the project having changed course. And so I think the question is, I want to just acknowledge that I think this question is really important. When we presented this project in various contexts, one thing that also really stood out for me was not only did we receive hate mail, but we also received email affirming the project. We got contacted by extended migrant networks. There were moments when I remember one moment distinctly reading some of the poems from the project, where someone came up to me afterwards and said, "This is so incredibly meaningful to me as an undocumented person in this country." So those kind of interactions, and then an interaction that I had with someone who came up and said, "I'm undocumented, and I also worked in a maquila that produced those phones." And that perhaps is the story that, among so many, has really stood out for me. I would also just add that when we were put under investigation, when we were having conversations about being charged with a federal felony, and people were saying things like, You need to make provisions for your son in the case that you're both arrested. What is going to happen if you're arrested? And my thought was, rather than be constructed as a certain kind of martyr for an artivist project, this is the experience of undocumented people in this country every day. What we were having to think about, of extended networks for where our then 4-year-old son, who's now 16 somewhere here, what was going to happen to him. That is so. To me, I've always tried to hold on to that center or core of that project. But when you ask the question, you're also asking about the transborder immigrant tool. And what's, so important, I think, are the different moments and the different kinds of projects that Ricardo has produced in these contexts of collaboration. So this is one of many artivist gestures. I don't know if that really answers your question. I can keep talking to you at the reception because, it's something I think about a lot, especially in terms of archive and preservation as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think all of that is key to a lot of artivist gestures, right? It's a core question. But I think, at least for me, the performative matrix have always found itself with this notion of Mayan technology. Which Subcomandante Marcos, I think, stated at one point, it is to no longer move at the speed of technology, but at the speed of dreams. And I certainly think these gestures are within that speed of dreams, and so they don't always cohere at the speed of technology. So it's that kind of issue and question.
There
There
is a way. And I haven't run this by you guys, so these are some thoughts I've had. They've never come up. So why not talk about it in front of 20 colleagues and a bunch of students? But I think there's a way in which the transporter immigrant tool was successful and was distributed to people. And one of the things that was taking place when we were doing the project and in our research and discussions with people and who had crossed and people in Mexico and organizations that help those people was that one of the first things that the organized crime groups would do is take people's phones away from them. They were very concerned that the people that they were trafficking across the desert didn't have a mobile phone. But something changed. In water station service, we started to find abandoned mobile phones and burner phones starting around 2015, 2016, and these were largely inexpensive Android phones. So what we think is going on there is not only did sort of the trafficking strategies change and they started to let people take their personal phones with them, but also that I believe that Google Maps was probably being used quite a bit because it goes back to that sort of technological conflagration, right, where the Border Patrol starts drag strips and then immigrants start to use shoes. Well, the Department of Homeland Security added an awful lot of technology to the Border Patrol, especially actually during the Obama administration and later. And so that necessitated people having access, people who are crossing having access to the technology. So in fact, a lot of people bring phones with them, have mapping applications with them now, at the time we were imagining this project, the phones none of that was really kind of available or thought about. That wasn't part of the GPS navigation imaginary at the time that we thought of this software and invented this software, but it certainly became part of the crossing experience later.
And certainly something that is done with alarm phones crossing the Mediterranean. There's the alarm phone community where you can use the cell phone to communicate when you're crossing the Mediterranean, because Frontex, the border patrol for Europe, doesn't help you if you're drowning. And so using the alarm phone system, communities of artists and artivists can find you, right? Using these kinds of scale ups. So I do think the technology and the scales that are available now are certainly clearly can be developed in other ways. But in 2007 to 2011, it was a little bit more difficult to navigate. Bueno, I think we should go eat. Yeah? So, adios.
We can keep talking about this.
Huh?
Yeah, we can keep talking about this
Yeah,
over
we can go
food.
on forever, yeah. Gracias, Doreen.
Gracias.
And there's books in the center of the gallery, and those you can take.
Huh. So you, there it is.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Really appreciate it.
I mean, they didn't need us to figure this out.
Hey.
We have nothing to do with it.